We'll begin here in just a minute. All right, we got that started. All right, I'm going to go to YouTube, turn off the chat. Theology Central. Going to turn that off. All right, I'm going to go to YouTube, turn off. All right, that's good to go. We got everything fixed. All right, we'll begin here in just a minute. North Carolina, thank you for tuning in at this late hour. But yeah, I want to finish this. We started it today. We had all kinds of technical difficulties. There was a automated voice playing during the live broadcast. That should not be there now. I think everything has been fixed. I think everything is good to go. So I'm not going to take a lot of time here. We're just going to jump right in. And I hope we're good to go. I'm going to go turn that off. I'm going to turn up the volume here. Okay. And I'm going to tell my daughter. All right. I'm going to, I'm telling my daughter that, hey, I'm broadcasting. There we go. All right. Yeah, it's late, so I'm going to see how far we can get this. Maybe we'll have to turn this into 3 parts, but I at least want to just kind of pick up, because when you wait 24 hours or 48 hours to do part 2, when you finally do part 2, it just feels so differently. This feels still somewhat within the same flow. Oh, wait a minute. I was our streaming bit rate. I'm just going to say it's good to go. I'm going to say it's good to go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, we go live in 5, 4, 3, 2. Oh, wait. I almost messed up. Did not have my Bible open. I mean, I've got most of the references in my notes, but I like to read from the actual Bible. And because sometimes in my notes, I have other translations that I'm using. And so the King James is what I teach from. So I always want to have my King James open here, since that's what I teach from. All right. So enough with all of that, ladies and gentlemen. We go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, and not even a dramatic pause. 1.
Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, June the 17th, 2025. It is currently 9:46 p.m. Central Time, and I'm coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. Now, typically when I do a late night episode, it's either 1, devotional, 2, we take a late night drive back to Salem and talk about the Salem witch trials, or 3, a lot of times we do, well, I won't say a lot of times since we haven't done a lot of episodes yet, but the Song of the Summer series, talking about the Song of the Summer, sometimes that fits a late night discussion. Late night discussions or late night programs, late night episodes usually have a certain vibe, a certain kind of feel to them. But I was here in the studio, was listening to music, and I'm like, well, I could do something about the Song of the Summer. I mean, I've been listening to music, but then I was like, well, I did part 1 earlier today. Maybe I need to do the part 2. And that part 1 was dealing with the subject of divorce and remarriage. And so we really dug into it exegetically, logically. I think we dealt with a lot of the inconsistency within the church. So I was like, well, I mean, I planned on doing part 2 maybe tomorrow, but once you get 24 hours or 48 hours removed from part 1, it takes on a different vibe. I'm like, so can I capture the same vibe, the same feeling in the late night episode? Probably not. But in some ways, maybe that's good. Maybe this part 2 needs to have a little bit more of a late night feeling, because that usually comes across maybe more, I don't know, maybe more devotional, maybe more emotional, because I think we can be honest. Divorce, just the whole subject of divorce, the actual divorce itself, when people go through divorce, I think they would say it's painful. I think it's personal. I think it can be traumatic. It can have long-lasting consequences. So divorce is an emotional, sensitive thing, just the divorce itself. And then when you bring divorce into the church, into Christian history, well, it's always going to be personal, but it's very polarizing. There's lots of controversy about it, because I know this is going to come as a shock to many of you. There's not much agreement on the subject of divorce in Christianity, within Christian history, within the church. I know it's a shock, because the reality is nobody agrees on literally anything. But when you talk about divorce, if you stand behind a pulpit and you preach to a congregation, you can almost guarantee that I would say probably close to 50 to 40% of your congregation. Now, every church is different, so there will always be exceptions. But I think probably, maybe 40%. I think that's being fair. I would have to look up actual statistics. But let's just say, in every church, you're going to have people sitting there who were married, who got divorced, and who are now remarried. In every single church. So if you preach about divorce, you are going to be greatly speaking on something you're going to be greatly impacting people. Let's state it that way. You're going to be greatly speaking to a subject that could be very sensitive to them. So how do you approach it? What do you do? Well, what I've wanted to demonstrate so far, if you go back and listen to part 1, and I'm going to review everything. I'll kind of reintroduce everything, and then I'll kind of work through everything and then summarize the point I really wanted to get across. Then we'll enter right into part 2 and see how far we can take this. If we have to do a part 3, that's great. I'm not going to go super long because I know it's late, but I thought, hey, I have the opportunity. I'm not doing anything else. Let's do this. All right. So I think that it's very important to remember that divorce is painful, that it's personal, and that it's polarizing, as I've already said. And I think it's very important to remember that right there in the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:27 through 32, Jesus addresses the subject, some would say in a very blunt and jarring way. And I think in many cases, what Jesus had to say about divorce in Matthew 5:27 through 32, I think is at Matthew 19 and Mark and in Luke. When you look at the things he had to say about divorce in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think we could agree that it typically throughout church history, it's left people confused, it's left people convicted, and it's definitely left a lot of people ready to argue. But what if, and I stress this, everyone's misunderstood it? What if, and not only what he said about divorce, what if people have misunderstood the entire Sermon on the Mount? Because I do believe, and I'm emphatic about that the church at large completely misunderstands the Sermon on the Mount. What if his words about divorce within the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Mount itself, what if it is not moral instruction? It's not a moral instruction manual, but it is a mirror. It's not a call to regulate people's relationships, but it is a divine confrontation with our own failure to love, to keep covenant, and to live faithfully before God. So what I'm trying to do in part 1, what I tried to do in part 1 and what I'm going to try to do in part 2 is I'm going to try to strip away the centuries of debate, because the debate's been going on forever. I'm going to try to confront the inconsistency that I think is very present in the church when it comes to this subject. And I'm going to try to call out the hypocrisy, because I think there's a lot of it. In part 1, we did not start with denominational rules or church policies or theological ideas. We started in part 1 by going to the Bible itself and simply asking, what does the text actually say? What did Jesus mean when he says divorce causes adultery? What does the church, why It's not why. I think I stated it more emphatically, or maybe I asked it as a question. Why does the church seem to treat divorced and remarried couples so differently than they treat other kinds of sinners? And then most importantly, we did not get to this in part 1. Maybe we'll get to it tonight. What is a law gospel message in all of this? Is there a law gospel message in all of it? So, it's not going to be an easy conversation. Part 1 wasn't. Part 2 is not going to be an easy conversation, but I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary for everyone. For everyone. Because here's the truth. When you're looking at this passage, Matthew 5:27-32, you're looking at what Jesus had to say about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Whenever you look at any of that, here's the truth. And I think this is very important. Listen, everyone, every single person, nobody walks away from the Sermon on the Mount and this passage on divorce and remarriage. No one walks away from the passage innocent. Everyone walks away guilty. And I think that's exactly where grace begins. Nobody walks away from this passage innocent. Nobody. All right? I've got to just dogmatically assert that. My issue is how the church handles the reality that no one walks away innocent, everyone walks away guilty, but yet treats some of the guilty people different than they choose other guilty people, because everyone is guilty. So what did we do? In part 1, we looked at God's design for marriage. And remember, we just looked at these texts from an observational way. We did not try to offer any exegesis or interpretation. We did observational work. We looked at God's design for marriage in Genesis 2:24 and Malachi 2:14-16. We basically said marriage is described as a covenant before God. God hates divorce. Though this is not the same as forbidding it, it just says he hates it. The context included treachery and unfaithfulness, implying moral fault in the divorce, especially in Malachi 2:14-16. We looked at the Mosaic law on divorce, which in Deuteronomy 24:1-4 left us a lot of questions about that, and we talked a little bit about that. And we said how some of that's not even applied today. Then we looked at Jesus' teaching, Matthew 5:31-32 and Matthew 19:3-9. Those are the two passages that everyone says has the exception clause. And typically the way this is read in churches is you're married and you have to stay married unless your partner commits adultery. Then you're free not only to get a divorce, then they typically teach you're also free to get remarried. The only problem is Matthew 5:31-32 and Matthew 19:3-9 does not say unless your partner commits adultery. It does not use the Greek word for adultery. It used pernaya, I think is how you say it. I would always say pernia, but it's pernaya, I think is the way it's actually pronounced, and which is a word for just basically translated fornication. So why does Jesus in Matthew 5:31-32 and Matthew 19:3-9 say, well, you stay married unless someone commits sexual immorality, and doesn't say adultery? So, well, I mean, we talked all about that in part 1, all right? We talked about in Mark 10 and Luke 16, there is no exception mentioned, none. It's do not get divorced, do not get remarried, because basically you're going to be an adulterer or an adulteress. We looked at Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11 and 1 Corinthians 7:12-15, which is very complicated because in 7:10-11, Paul's like, hey, I'm not giving you this command, God is. And then 12-15, he's saying, God is not giving you this command, I am. And that's already enough complication right there. Then we talked about Romans 7:2-3. So if we kind of gave us, I won't go back through everything. We did a basic overview, and we got kind of a basic idea. And here's what I'm going to stress this. From just looking at these scriptures from a very observational way, not trying to do much interpretation, just trying to see what's there, we had to conclude this. It is not only possible, it is very plausible then that there are people who are married, who got divorced, who are remarried today, and the Bible would call them adulterers. that they are living in an adulterers, that they are in adultery, that they are living in an adulterous relationship, and every time they engage in physical intimacy, they are committing adultery. It's possible that in every church there are people who meet that criteria, because the Bible makes it clear that it is possible for people to have been married, divorced, and remarried, and they, even if you allow for an exception clause, they don't truly meet the exception clause. Now, guess what? In every church where those people possibly exist, they're not treated as adulterers. They're not being excommunicated. They're not being told to be celibate. They partake in the Lord's Supper. Some of them are in active ministry, and they're treated just like they're in good standing and they're good, faithful, godly people. In that same very church, if a young person is found guilty of committing fornication, they may be publicly shamed and have to give a public confession. If a man is caught looking at pornography, he may have to have an accountability partner and a filter and all of this. And if someone in the church commits adultery, they will possibly be excommunicated. Now, wait a minute. You've got literally people sitting in the church living in an adulterous relationship, and they get a free pass, but everyone else has to abstain and can't do this and can't do that, and they get in trouble. Everyone has to see that as that's troubling to me. All right. So we looked, and there's a lot more we could go there, but I just want to make it very clear, just looking at it as in an observational way. At the very least, you should walk away going, well, there are situations someone could be married, divorced, and remarried, and they're living in adultery. Oh my, what do we do? We also pointed out in part 1 that Matthew, and this is hermeneutically very important, Matthew is the only gospel that includes an explicit exception clause allowing for divorce and potential remarriage in the case of sexual immorality. Only Matthew mentions an exception, Matthew 5:32. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. So there's the chance that marriage and divorce can lead someone into adultery. Now, there's an exception there, but what does that exception mean? Matthew 19:9. Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, and please note, neither passage says everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of adultery. None of them say that. They say on the ground of sexual immorality, or as the King James translated it, fornication. Why is it not using the word adultery? Because in the very same passage, when it says commit adultery, then it uses the actual Greek word for adultery. So the translators clearly use two different Greek words. Mark, Luke, and Paul do not include the exception, period. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Mark 10:11-12, Luke 16:18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. No exceptions are given. These passages present Jesus' teaching in absolute terms. So then what does that tell me? Well, first, it tells me that there is the possibility that people could be married, got divorced and got remarried, and are possibly in an adulterous relationship. That it's possible, and it also shows that it is possible, maybe even plausible, that the so-called exceptions that people allow, well, you got divorced, but you meet this exception, so you get a pass, right? That even that could be called into question because we've got Jesus teaching on the subject and the other passages, and the exception is never even brought up. So then I brought up in the last part, isn't it hermeneutically significant that the Greek word used for sexual immorality in Matthew passage isn't the Greek word for adultery, but the word for fornication? And now let me remind you, I'm going to play you the two Greek words. All right, here we go. All right, here's the first one. The first Greek word, this is the one translated fornication, all right? If anyone shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of. So if you put away your wife, except for this reason, and the reason is not adultery, it's this Greek word, porneia.
Strong's G, 4202, porneia. Parnaya.
I say pornea. It's pornaya. I always say pornea. I always say it wrong. All right. Pornaya. Okay. So I'll finally, for 20 years, I think I've heard every pastor say it incorrectly. Pornaya. Probably in Greek class I heard it correctly, but all these years later, I just have fallen into the trap of saying pornea. All right. Pornaya. All right. Now, maybe I said it correctly here and there, but you get the idea. Now again, that word is not adultery. That's the word that's translated fornication. In the same passage, the same sentence, when it talks about if you put her away or you put them away, they will commit adultery. It's this Greek word.
Strong's G 3429. Moichao.
Moihao. Completely different Greek words. I cannot stress it enough. In the very same verse, even though everyone will say, no, you can get a divorce if your spouse commits adultery. I'm like, the verse doesn't even say that. It doesn't even say that. All right. So we talked about this. I'll go through this quickly. Matthew 5:32 and chapter 19, verse 9 uses porneia, commonly translated as fornication. All right. Mahaya, all right, the word for adultery is used elsewhere and used elsewhere in the very same verse to describe what happens if someone divorces and remarries unlawfully. All right? Except for porneia, you commit adultery. All right? Now, why does this matter? Precision in language. If Jesus had meant to allow divorce for adultery, marital unfaithfulness after marriage, then why would he not use the word that is translated adultery as he does in the rest of the verse? It would be like, if you're married and you put away your wife except for adultery, you're going to cause them to commit adultery. But he does not say that. That's not even a debate. It's a fact. Using porneia implies a broader category or a different context than straightforward adultery. Now, there's some possible interpretive paths to why this is going on. First, there's what we know as Jewish betrothal interpretation. This was the common interpretation of some church fathers. It's still held in Catholicism and some Protestant churches. Porneia refers to sexual immorality. So this is how it's understood. We'll call it the Jewish betrothal interpretation. The porneia refers to sexual immorality during the betrothal period, as seen in Matthew 1:18 through 19, when Joseph, finding out that Mary is with child and assuming then she's committed sexual immorality before marriage, but during the betrothal, he's going to put her away because Jewish betrothal would require a divorce because it was considered binding. On this reading, Matthew's exception allows divorce only in the case of discovery of premarital unchastity before the marriage is consummated. So there isn't any exception clause for marriage. The exception clause is during the betrothal period. That's how this interpretation would work. Now, why is this? What's the strength of this? Well, it harmonizes with Mark and Luke, which allow for no exceptions. Now, you have some within Christianity who offer what they call a broad sexual immorality interpretation. And this is common in a lot of evangelical churches. They say porneia includes adultery, prostitution, incest, etc., 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 etc. So divorce and remarriage are permitted for sexual betrayal, whether it was done during marriage or before marriage. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If any kind of sexual immorality happens, whether before you got married or during you're married, it doesn't matter. That's grounds for divorce and for remarriage. Now, if you take that far, well, then wait a minute. Any sexual immorality? Because the verses right before this in Matthew 5, the verse on Matthew 5, 27 through 28, or 29, Matthew 5, 27 through 29, and 5, 27 through 30, before you get to the discussion about divorce in 31 and 32, that equates lust with adultery. So that if porneia refers to any sexual immorality, and Jesus says even looking at a woman with lust makes you an adulterer, then if you're not careful, you know what you're saying? If anyone has ever committed any type of sexual immorality before you got married, during your marriage, and that would even include lust, then you can get a divorce and you can get remarried. Well, at that point, every Christian marriage is invalid because it's going to be easy to find a way to basically find grounds then for you to be able to get divorced and get remarried. It just then... There's no any point in even teaching this anymore because anyone could justify their divorce and justify their remarriage. All right. Now, context clarity, I think, in Matthew would lead us to this. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. They would be familiar with betrothal divorce practices. Matthew uniquely includes Joseph's desire to divorce Mary for porneia, reinforcing the betrothal period view. So I think if you look at Matthew and you look at the audience, you look at the fact it's the only gospel that records Joseph wanting to put away Mary, it's the only gospel that offers the exception clause, then the exception clause is, if we're going to apply it to modern times, if you're engaged and you realize that this person has committed sexual immorality, you can put them away, which we already allow in our idea of engagement. At that point, they had to give them a certificate of divorce. You're trying to carry something over from a cultural context that doesn't fit our cultural context. All right? So, now, let's move on. That's a lot of review, but it gets us all back on the same page. If we interpret Jesus' exception clause, except for porneia, in Matthew 5:32 and 19:9, to mean that divorce is allowed for adultery, and then broaden adultery to include emotional adultery, mental lust, or desire, we quickly enter into theologically and logically dangerous territory. All right? Now, here's what I did. I gave this idea to GPT, to AI. I said, okay, if we interpret the exception clause, saying, okay, except for porneia, or porneia, again, I always want to say porneia, I apologize, but porneia, and we say that means divorce, if we say porneia means divorce, which it doesn't, but it means sexual immorality, but it could include, adultery, if we say that means a divorce is allowed for adultery, if we say that, and then if we go to the verses right before it, and adultery can be lust and desire, then we run into some possible problems, don't we? So I asked AI, do we run into problems? Here's what AI, artificial intelligence, says. It says, Jesus' teaching in context, internal sin condemned, not civilly prosecuted. In Matthew 5:27 through 28, Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This verse teaches that lustful desire is morally equivalent to adultery in God's eyes. But that doesn't mean it carries the same legal or relational consequences in society or marriage. Now, I struggle here, right? Okay, theologically, it's the same. But wait. It's not the same legally. Okay, but legally do we interpret this from a legal perspective or a theological perspective? Jesus is saying it's the same thing. But, okay, let's say we try to make this distinction. AI says if adultery, being adultery in the heart and the mind and the desire, emotional, spiritual, any kind of adultery, right? Then every spouse could claim divorce simply based on a thought, impulse, or struggle with lust. Jesus' very teaching intended to reveal the heart's sinfulness and drive us to our need for mercy. It would be twisted into a license for ending marriages. Now, I think that's, whatever you do with the exception clause, let's make it very clear. The Sermon on the Mount was designed to break you and crush you under requirements in which you cannot keep. The whole point of the Sermon on the Mount is that you have to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Those are the exact words Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Your righteousness must exceed the scribes and the Pharisees. It must be perfect internally and externally. So his teaching on marriage, divorce, adultery, it is supposed to give you a standard that you're going to be like, well, who can follow it? We're all guilty. We're all doomed, which then drives you to Christ, because the law is to expose your sin, show you can't do it, drive you to Christ. The one who preached the Sermon on the Mount is the one who obeyed the Sermon on the Mount, and then his obedience is imputed to me by faith alone. So it's weird that people go to the Sermon on the Mount and then look to Matthew 5 and try to say, oh, I have an exception here. This is where I can get a divorce and get remarried. That is a complete misunderstanding of what the passage is trying to do. It's trying to show you your sinfulness, not to give you a way out. Jesus is using the law to expose internal guilt. It convicts everyone. But he never says that lustful thoughts give someone the right to dissolve a marriage. So you either have to go, well, wait a minute. When Jesus talks about you can get a divorce for, if he's offering an exception clause, well, for any kind of sexual immorality or for adultery, well, just forget that he said that adultery is just looking at a woman with lust, because, well, that's somewhat different. I still struggle with that. I think the point is this leads to lots of difficulty here. The difference between lawful grounds and universal guilt. If internal sin equals grounds for divorce, then every person is guilty, every marriage is invalid, and every marriage could justifiably end. Now, I do agree with AI here. If I look at a woman with lust and I'm an adulterer, and that's a grounds for divorce, well, then I'm sorry, every person is guilty. Every marriage is invalid, and every marriage could justifiably end. And maybe in some ways that's what's being driven home from a theological standpoint. But obviously not everyone agrees with that. Now, some would say Scripture, maybe tradition are clear. Moral guilt and divorce justification are not the same. Just because someone is morally guilty does not mean that justifies divorce. Jesus intensifies the law to show our need for grace, not to provide an escape clause. I don't believe he's trying to provide an escape clause. I do agree there. Now, emotional and mental adultery is real sin, but some would say it's not legal grounds. Emotional unfaithfulness and fantasy are sin and must be repented of. They wound relationships, but they are not equivalent to the physical act of adultery. That constituted grounds for stoning or divorce in the Mosaic Law. But the Mosaic Law did not look at the internal. The Mosaic Law only looked at the external, and the Mosaic Law had a civil aspect to it. So AI wants to try to draw this distinction. Can you draw the distinction? Well, hey, if you do draw the distinction, then why? It's weird. Sometimes the church will draw this distinction. Well, you've committed lust, or you had an emotional adultery or some kind of fantasy adultery. You had some kind of adultery. It wasn't physical, so it's not the same. So that's not a grounds for divorce. But then on the other hand, they'll say, wait, you committed adultery. Now you have to be basically crucified because you looked at this or you did. Well, wait, either it is the same or it isn't the same. The church has to make a decision. And if it's not the same, then you can't treat people as if they committed adultery. Well, once we start drawing those distinctions, then what? Did Jesus' words even mean anything? Well, maybe you just say, well, it just means you're morally guilty before God the same way. But when it comes to practice, we're not going to treat it the same. But then don't people treat it the same? If everyone could divorce on the grounds of simply internal adultery, then marriage becomes conditional on perfect thought control. And that's true. It would never work. Divorce becomes universal. That is true. And Jesus' call to forgiveness, restoration, and covenant loyalty would be voided. So it leads to all kinds of problems. All right. So I was like, okay, I do agree with what AI is trying to do. It's trying to make this distinction because you just run. Look, let's make it very clear. So let me just go back and reestablish some very clear points here. I'm trying to keep this as clear as possible. No matter what position you take, the Bible makes it very clear there is a great possibility and even plausibility that there are people who are married, divorced, and remarried, and they have to be theologically considered to be living in adultery. Those people exist in probably every church. What do you do? Do you treat them differently? At the same time, it's absolutely theologically and hermeneutically a fact that the text does not say if you're married, if someone commits adultery, you can get divorced and you can get remarried. It does not say that. It talks about if someone commits fornication, which is a different Greek word than the word for adultery. Why does that distinction exist? Well, is it possible that the distinction is if you are basically in the betrothal stage and someone commits sexual immorality and it's discovered, you can put them away, just as Joseph prepares to do to Mary in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew gives the exception clause, and Matthew's the only one who gives the example of someone doing that exact thing. Then, to me, okay. Then it's not that applicable for us other than in our engagement stage. But if we take the position that divorce is only allowed for physical adultery. Let's say we take that. Let's say, okay, you know what? And we can get into the whole discussion of mental adultery, physical adultery, how they are the same, how are they different? Does one allow for divorce, not allow for divorce? Do we treat them equally? Because I think the church is all over the place in how we play that game. I think it's because it'll be like, well, I mean, everyone commits adultery because they lust, but that's different than, and then we draw all of these we try to quantify it, and it's very messy when we try to do that. But let's just take the position that divorce is only allowed for physical adultery. Right? And even then, many argue it permits divorce, but it doesn't require it. Some would say, okay, it allows for it. Even others would say it does not permit it. Then remarriage after an unbiblical divorce is, according to Jesus' words, adultery. We would have to agree there. Even if we allow that, hey, you can get divorced if physical adultery occur. Even if you allow that, you have to admit that remarriage after an unbiblical divorce is, according to Jesus' very own words, adultery. So if someone was married, got divorced, and got remarried, and that divorce did not meet, even if we allow for this exception, does not meet the exception perfectly, which it would only be an actual physical affair, a physical adultery. Only that. If someone gets married, divorced, and remarried, and that's not the actual case, then they are living in adultery. So this raises an extremely difficult pastoral and theological problem. What do you do? Well, what does Jesus say? Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. These statements are broad, absolute, and scandalous, I think in a scandalous way, very rigid compared to what we see in modern day Christianity. So if the churches were truly going to implement Jesus' teachings consistently, this would mean, number one, many remarried couples would be seen as living in ongoing adultery. If their first divorce was not on biblical grounds, meaning no physical adultery, and then they remarried, Jesus' words would imply their current marriage is an adulterous union. What do you do? Well, if we were going to really put it into practice, church discipline would then be required. If adultery is ongoing, unrepented sin, then according to Matthew 18, some would say such members should be confronted, and if unrepentant, ultimately excluded from fellowship. That's what some people would say. Some would be called to permanent celibacy. If the current marriage is considered invalid and cannot be maintained without continuing in adultery, the logical application of this would be to call to separate and live celibately, which many would see as deeply impractical or even cruel. So others would be like, that's insane. No way. Not going to do that. I'm not going. Now, it's always interesting. They're divorced, married, remarried. They want to abstain, but they'll tell everyone else, you abstain, you abstain, you abstain, you abstain. And if you don't, you're a fornicator, you're an adulterer, you're a porn addict. But then they'll go home and engage in physical intimacy, which is clearly adulterous from a biblical standpoint. But no, they will never get in trouble for it. It's the most inconsistent system that we have within modern Christianity. So I asked AI about this. I said, okay, what happens? AI says almost no churches follow this. Many churches claim to believe in biblical marriage and divorce teachings, yet they fully accept remarried couples, even those with clearly unbiblical divorces. There's almost zero consistency in applying Jesus' words, especially compared to how other sins are handled. In contrast, some sins, same-sex relationship, abortion, financial dishonesty, are treated with far more severity, even though Jesus speaks more directly and harshly about divorce and remarriage. Even AI is like, nobody follows this. So I said, AI, so what should we do? And AI's like, well, here's a few possible approaches. Number one, a strict literalist approach. Only recognize remarriage after biblically valid divorces due to physical adultery. And then you would have to contact the other person to see if physical adultery actually occurred, because anybody could show up and say, my previous wife committed adultery, and you would have no way of knowing. So you either take their word for it or you'd have to go verify. And the reason he said, well, why would you verify? Because then you would have people in your church who are living in an open adultery. So do you either you care or you don't care? All others are called to repent, cease the second marriage, and possibly live celibately. So anybody else, if their marriage doesn't meet the criteria, you can't engage in physical relations. You know that's not going to occur. And then some would say, well, then you have to apply church discipline to unrepentant remarried individuals living in what Jesus calls adultery. Never going to happen. So I said, AI, so what happens here? AI said, well, this would destroy almost nearly every church. It would wipe out pews, wipe out a lot of pulpits, and very few could withstand such scrutiny. To really put this into practice, there would be nothing left of the church. And that's exactly what I was told. And the fourth school I ever attended was, just cut this out. It's never going to work in practice. And I was like, what? AI said you could go with modified pastoral realism. Affirm Jesus' high standard. Hey, Jesus has a high standard here. Acknowledge past failure. Offer grace and accept remarried couples as validly, or their marriage is valid. Let's do it that way. Calling them to faithfulness from this point forward. Hey, you can't change the past. You're saved. God's grace is sufficient. Now just be faithful now and move forward. Now, the only problem is you're saying be faithful, but they're literally committing adultery every time they're together. And it's just so weird because, well, why don't you offer that to everyone? Why don't you offer it to the same-sex couple? Hey, you're saved now. You know what? Y'all just continue on. No, everybody say absolutely not. Well, hey, that person keeps looking at porn. Well, there's grace. Just try to be faithful now. And I guess somehow you can be faithful while you're committing adultery. So I don't even know how that works. AI says the problem is this ignores Jesus' own words and leaves the theological contradiction unresolved. It offers grace, but at a cost of textual and moral integrity. Yeah, it offers grace to a specific group of people while you keep it from everyone else. That just doesn't make any sense. Now, you could go to the Catholic system and about trying to get your marriage annulled, and you could do all of that. And then say, but then is an annulment a biblical concept? Well, I got my marriage annulled, so it doesn't count. Can the church just say, you're right, your previous marriage we've investigated your previous marriage and it wasn't legitimate, so it's annulled? There's no biblical grounds for that. AI said this, and AI got very blunt here. If churches are not going to treat remarried members as adulterers, they must stop using the biblical marriage standard to morally posture in the culture wars. The church's approach is not only hypocritical, but it becomes morally incoherent and unjust. From a logical, hermeneutical, and ethical standpoint, it is deeply inconsistent and profoundly unfair for churches to welcome remarried couples whose first marriage were ended without clear biblical justification and whom Jesus calls adulterers, while disciplining others or excluding other people for sins like pornography, fornication, or same-sex relationships. The inconsistency reveals a major moral double standard and how churches apply Jesus' teaching on sexual ethics. So AI is like, this is just not fair. AI says, Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Whoever divorces and marries another commits adultery. There's no ambiguity in Jesus' words. Remarriage after an illegitimate divorce equals adultery. And then again, we have to define, is that illegitimate divorce because of adultery? Because it's not, Jesus doesn't say because of adultery, because of sexual immorality. And I think he's referring to the betrothal period. It's the only thing that makes any sense. But even if you say it's for this, then anybody else who's remarried, they're living in adultery. Yet, many churches ignore or soften when dealing with divorcees who remarry. They never call it adultery. There's no call really for even really any serious repentance, definitely no call for celibacy. They allow them to be members, serve in ministry, and live without guilt or correction. Meanwhile, others face church discipline for pornography. Typically, confession may be required. Accountability will be demanded, and they may be barred from service and ministry. Fornication is condemned, required to separate or cease sexual activity. Homosexuality is treated as completely disqualifying for membership or leadership. Adultery will lead to immediate discipline, shame, counseling, and removal from all ministry. Yet you can have people in the church who's voting on your discipline who's living in adultery. It's maddening. AI says, but remarried couples, even those whose divorces were clearly unbiblical, there's no scrutiny, there's no discipline, there's no demand for repentance, just a fresh start. Now go live and be happy and live happily ever after. Have all the physical intimacy you want. Enjoy. So, what would be the moral here? All right, kids, if you're in a marriage, it starts falling apart, leave church, get divorced, get remarried, show back up at church and say, oh, well, everything fell apart. It was really bad. And I was really sorry. And I told God that I'm sorry. And here I am today. And they'll be like, welcome, brother. Welcome, sister. Live your lives and be happy. Well, everyone else will be in trouble and being judged and be condemned for their sin. This creates a hermeneutical contradiction and pastoral injustice. Same sin, different response. Jesus calls remarriage after divorce adultery, but those committing ongoing adultery are treated better than someone who commits a momentary act of fornication or views porn. That couple's living in ongoing adultery. But you looked at porn, or you committed fornication, and now we are going to burn you at the stake. And there's no real repentance expected. Churches demand repentance and changed behavior for people for all kinds of things. But for remarried couples, even if they're out of biblical bounds, there's basically nothing. And it's kind of rewarding the right kind of sexual sin. If your sexual sin is in the form of a socially accepted remarriage, you're good to go. But if it's solo, porn, illicit, affair, hookup, same sex, you get in trouble. AI says this is nothing more than selective literalism. Churches preach biblical marriage and claim to uphold Jesus' teaching, yet openly disregard his clearest and most repeated statements on divorce and remarriage. So it says basically churches pick and choose which of Jesus' words they will enforce. Now, I'll stop right there. So what do we have? Here's what we have. We have clear evidence in the Bible that is very possible and plausible for people to be married, get divorced, and get remarried, and that would be considered an adulterous relationship. It's very possible. It is absolutely a fact that you cannot say, well, Jesus says I can get a divorce if my spouse committed adultery, because he does not use that word. He uses a different word, porneia, which is fornication. So Jesus says, hey, if you're married, you cannot put away your spouse unless they've committed sexual immorality. And if you put them away without that, then they will commit adultery. And if you remarry someone, if someone remarries that person, they've committed adultery. Right? That would be the exception clause. But it's not because of adultery, it's because of sexual immorality. Why are there two different words? Well, the only thing that makes any sense is that Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience, and he's referring to the Jewish betrothal divorce. If you're betrothed, that was binding. If the person is found to have committed sexual immorality during the betrothal period, then you could put them away. Then you could put them away. During the betrothal period, just like Joseph was going to do with Mary. That seems to be the only thing that makes any sense, because the other gospels do not have the exception clause and seems emphatic. You're married, you put someone away, and you marry someone else, you're committing adultery. So at the very least, we have to say, not only is it possible and plausible that there are people sitting in the church who are in an adulterous relationship because they're remarried, not only is that possible and plausible, it's also possible and plausible that a lot of people who are claiming the exception clause could still be, now again, there's lots of debate on how to interpret the exception clause, but there's a chance that they could be living in adultery night after night, week after week, and are walking around as if they're morally superior. And even if you say, well, I think the exception clause is okay, even if you go with that, the question is, what if you're wrong? Are you now going to stand in judgment of other people when you could possibly be living in an open, straight adultery, but you don't care? So no matter how you look at it, you've got people in every church that are either in clear violation because they don't even meet the exception clause, or you've got a lot of people in your church who think they meet the exception clause, but the exception clause is questionable at best, so there's a possibility that all of them are living in adultery. And while all of that adultery is going on in your church, you're condemning everyone else for their sexual sin. No one sees a problem there? Now, I am not condemning anyone. I am not condemning anyone. Because let me make it very clear. Every single person is a sinner. They're an adulterer. They're a murderer. They're a liar. They're an idolater. If you're guilty of one point of the law, you're guilty of all of it. And every single one of us is in a perpetual state of guilt on at least one point of the law. We do not love God with all our heart, mind, body, and soul. We do not love our neighbor as ourselves. We have idolatry in the heart. We have lust in the heart. We're adulterers. We're fornicators. We're sexually immoral inside of all of us to some level. And even if it's not sexual immorality, there's plenty of other things. Everyone is guilty. Everyone. Married, divorced, it doesn't matter. And that's a hard thing for Christianity to understand, because we want everything to be this moral system. But our moral systems become very inconsistent. Well, we can't go after all of these people because we got a lot of people here who are married, divorced, and remarried. We can't call them out. But everyone else we can go after. Everyone else we can condemn. But wait a minute, how can they be condemned when they're sitting right there? There's such a major flaw here. You say, well, God's grace covers all sin. So you're telling me God's grace covers all sin. So not only does it cover the sin of getting the divorce, it now covers the ongoing adultery. Well, then guess what? Hey, teenagers, God's grace covers it. Go have all the premarital sex you want. Hey, look at all the porn you want. Hey, have all the affairs you want, because God's grace covers what? Like, nobody would say that. But in this particular case, somehow grace covers everything. How does it work for some and not others? It's a reality. This is not even up for debate. Every church has people sitting in the pew who have been married, divorced, and remarried. And they are either in violation of the exception clause, or they're in violation and are in an adulterous relationship because maybe they have misinterpreted the exception clause in the first place. You say, well, I don't agree with that interpretation of the exception clause. Okay, but just what if your interpretation is wrong? Because there's no agreement on it in 2,000 years in church history. Just what if? I know you're going to tell yourself your interpretation is right, but it's the same thing when homosexuals argue, well, I don't believe the Bible condemns homosexuality. I don't believe, well, if you love someone, I think that means you're married. So we're married. Even if we don't have, people have been making every kind of excuse for every sin under this. Well, then don't get mad at them when they make excuses. Because they say, well, I don't agree with your interpretation. Everyone can say, I don't agree with the interpretation that condemns us. I mean, everyone wants to do that. You say, well, what do? I don't know what to do. I don't know what I know? Whether you're married or whether you're divorced or whether you're remarried, you know what you are? You are a sinner. Whether you're single, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where everyone is guilty. And all we can do is run to Christ and say, you kept this law perfectly. I don't. You're the bridegroom who's been faithful to the bride perfectly, and your faithfulness is imputed to me. So I stand in you perfect, but in practice, my life led me here, and I'm in a sinful relationship, and I'm going to be committing sin on a regular, consistent basis. Because even if you're celibate, you're still going to be living in sin. I know nobody likes that, but it's just the reality of it. I could, it doesn't matter what I do. I could rip out my eyes, rip off my ears, cut off my hands, go to a monastery and put me in a padded cell and I never come out. My brain would be there and my heart. And guess where all the sinfulness comes from? Inside of me. So I'd still be committing some kind of sin internally. And that's the reality and I think the Sermon on the Mount is trying to show you that it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter if you're married. It doesn't matter if you're divorced. It doesn't matter if you're remarried. It doesn't matter if you're single. You are in sin. Nobody gets out clean. All right, I'll stop right there. Whew, that's a lot to try to keep straight. I know I was messing up the Greek word. I apologize. I should have just went with porneia because every pastor I know says it that way. I should have just went with that, but the actual Greek word, I hate when I mess it up. Okay, here we go. It is porneia.
Strong's G,
Porneia.
4202.
Porneia. I say porneia. Porneia, at least if I'm saying porneia, I'm close. I still want to say porneia, porneia. So I should have just went with porneia because that's how everyone states it. But you want to be accurate. So I don't know where that leaves us. It leaves us with very few answers. But you know what? That's kind of the way it works. The law, actually, I take it back. The law will always lead us to two things. We're guilty, and Christ is our only hope. No matter your situation, you're always going to be left with that. You're guilty, and Christ is our only hope. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if we're talking marriage. Doesn't matter if we're talking pornography. Doesn't matter if we're talking complaining, grumbling, idolatry, lying, gossip. We're all going to be left with the same answer. We're guilty. And I don't have any good answers for it. I just get tired of the inconsistency. The people, in many cases, pointing the finger and judging and even voting on church discipline are literally living in adultery while they excommunicate someone who's committed adultery. That's the most insane thing I have ever seen in my life. That's what that whole idea, hey, he who's without sin cast the first stone. I know there's argument about that story being in the Bible, but the concept really is, can anybody throw a stone? I can't. Because I'm a liar, I'm a gossip, I'm a cheat, I'm an adulterer, I'm a murderer, I'm a thief, I'm an idolater. I'm all of those things. Thought, word, deed, you name it, all of it. And if you're not, well, congratulations. I guess you found a way to being perfect, but I have a feeling I'm talking to other sinners. Thanks for listening. God bless.